The steady beep of the heart monitor was the first sound that penetrated Malcolm Thornton's consciousness. It was a rhythmic, persistent noise that slowly pulled him from the depths of a dreamless slumber. His eyelids felt heavy, refusing to open despite his growing awareness. The antiseptic smell of a hospital room filled his nostrils, and he could feel the scratch of starched sheets against his skin. Malcolm tried to move, but his body seemed disconnected from his brain. Panic began to rise in his chest as he struggled to piece together what had happened. Where was he? Why couldn't he move? The last thing he remembered was... His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door opening and closing softly. Footsteps approached his bed, and he heard the rustle of clothing as someone sat down nearby. A familiar perfume wafted through the air. Chanel No. 5, his wife Evelyn's signature scent. "Oh, Malcolm!" Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper, tinged with what sounded like concern. "Oh, what a mess this has all become." Malcolm wanted to open his eyes, to reach out and touch her hand, to ask her what had happened, but his body remained stubbornly unresponsive. He focused all his energy on trying to move, to give some sign that he could hear her. "Mr. Thornton?" A new voice, professional and crisp. "I'm Dr. Patel. I'm here to discuss your husband's condition, Mrs. Thornton." "Of course, doctor. Please tell me there's been some improvement." Dr. Patel cleared her throat. "I'm afraid there's been no significant change. Mr. Thornton's condition remains critical. The trauma from the accident was severe, and while we've managed to stabilize him, he's still in a coma. We're monitoring him closely, but at this point, it's impossible to predict when or if he'll regain consciousness." Malcolm's mind reeled. Accident? Coma? How long had he been here? "I understand," Evelyn replied, her voice steady. "And what are his chances of recovery?" "It's difficult to say with certainty. Given the extent of his injuries and the duration of his coma, even if he does wake up, there's a high probability of significant cognitive impairment." There was a long pause, and Malcolm could almost feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him. He wanted to scream, to tell them he was awake, that he could hear them, but his body remained stubbornly still. "I see," Evelyn finally said. "Thank you for your honesty, doctor. I appreciate it." "Of course. We'll continue to do everything we can for Mr. Thornton. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to ask." "Actually, there is one thing," Evelyn said, her tone shifting slightly. "Given the circumstances, I think it's time I spoke with our lawyer about Malcolm's will. Would it be possible to have a private moment with my husband?" "Certainly, Mrs. Thornton. Take all the time you need. I'll make sure you're not disturbed." The sound of retreating footsteps was followed by the soft click of the door closing. Malcolm felt a surge of anticipation. Surely now, alone with him, Evelyn would express her love, her hope for his recovery. He strained to hear her words. "Oh, Malcolm," Evelyn sighed, but there was something off about her tone. It lacked the warmth he expected. "What am I going to do with you?" He felt her hand on his, but her touch was light, almost reluctant. "I suppose I should be grateful," she continued, her voice lowered. "All those years of putting up with your obsession with work, your neglect, and now it seems it might finally pay off." Malcolm's mind raced. What was she talking about? "I know it's terrible to think this way, but, well, the doctor doesn't seem very optimistic, does she? And if you don't recover..." Evelyn's voice trailed off, and he heard her rummage in her purse. The click of a compact opening, followed by the sound of lipstick being applied. "I hate to be crude, darling, but you know what they say. Where there's a will, there's a way. And your will is very generous, isn't it? All those millions, all those properties. I won't have to worry about a thing." Malcolm felt as if his blood had turned to ice. This couldn't be happening. Evelyn, his wife of 20 years, the woman he had devoted his life to, was sitting by his hospital bed speculating about his death and her inheritance. "I should call Robert," Evelyn mused, and Malcolm recognized the name of their lawyer. Best to be prepared, just in case. No point in letting all that money get tied up in probate, is there? As Evelyn continued to talk, seemingly to herself, about the details of his will and her plans for the future, Malcolm made a decision. They thought he was in a coma, helpless and unaware, but he was conscious. He could hear everything, and he wasn't about to let Evelyn or anyone else take advantage of his condition. With every ounce of willpower he possessed, Malcolm focused on keeping his body still, his breathing steady. He would pretend to be in a coma, to be as good as dead. And from this invisible vantage point, he would learn the truth about his wife, his business, and everyone around him. Let them think he was gone. Malcolm Thornton was very much alive, and he was going to fight for his life and his legacy in a way none of them could imagine. The days that followed Malcolm's awakening blurred together in a haze of beeping machines, hushed conversations, and the constant struggle to maintain his facade. Every muscle in his body ached with the effort of remaining still. Every nerve screamed for movement, for acknowledgement. But Malcolm Thornton, the man who had built an empire through sheer force of will, channeled all of his legendary determination into this most crucial performance of his life. Visitors came and went. Evelyn was a constant presence, her saccharine voice grating on Malcolm's nerves as she played the part of the grieving wife to perfection. He had to give her credit. If he hadn't overheard her true thoughts that first day, he might have been fooled by her act. "Oh, Malcolm," she would sigh, her hand resting lightly on his. "You have to wake up, darling. The house is so empty without you." But there was always an undercurrent to her words, a hint of impatience that Malcolm now recognized all too clearly. It was on the fourth day of his silent vigil that things took an interesting turn. The door to his room opened, and a familiar voice reached his ears. "Mrs. Thornton, I'm sorry to disturb you, but I thought it best we speak in person." Robert Blackwell, Malcolm's lawyer and longtime friend, or so he had thought. Malcolm strained to hear every word of their conversation. "Robert, thank you for coming," Evelyn said, her voice low. "I've been thinking about what we discussed on the phone." "Evelyn," Robert interrupted, his tone cautious. "Are you sure about this? Malcolm's condition hasn't changed. It might be premature to— To what? To ensure that his wishes are carried out?" Evelyn's voice took on a sharp edge. "You heard what the doctor said. Even if by some miracle he wakes up, he'll never be the same. Do you really think Malcolm would want to live like that? A shell of himself, unable to run his company, to make decisions?" There was a long pause, and Malcolm could almost feel the tension in the room. He wished desperately that he could open his eyes, could see the expressions on their faces. "You may be right," Robert finally conceded. "But we need to tread carefully. The board is already nervous. If we move too quickly to enact the provisions in Malcolm's will, it could raise suspicions." "Suspicions?" Evelyn laughed, a brittle sound that Malcolm had never heard from her before. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm his wife. Everything he has is rightfully mine." "It's not that simple, and you know it," Robert replied, his voice firmer now. "Malcolm's will is complex. There are provisions for the company, for charitable donations, not to mention the clause about— "I know about the clause," Evelyn snapped. "That ridiculous stipulation about sound mind and body? It's absurd. He's clearly not of sound mind or body now, is he?" Malcolm's mind raced. The clause. He remembered insisting on its inclusion, much to Robert's confusion. It stated that his assets would only transfer if he was of sound mind and body at the time of his death. A safeguard he had put in place on a whim, never imagining it would come into play like this. "Nevertheless," Robert was saying, "we need to be cautious. I suggest we wait another week, see if there's any change in his condition. Then we can start the process of having him declared legally incompetent. That should satisfy the terms of the will." "A week?" Evelyn sounded exasperated. "Robert, every day we wait is another day that vultures could swoop in. You know as well as I do that there are people who would love to get their hands on Malcolm's company, his assets. We need to act now." "I understand your concern, Evelyn, but rushing this could backfire spectacularly. Trust me, I've seen it happen. Give it a week. Use the time to gather support from the board, to prepare for the transition. It'll be smoother in the long run." There was a long silence, and Malcolm could picture Evelyn's face, the way her jaw would clench when she was frustrated but trying not to show it. Finally, she spoke. "Fine, 1 week, but not a day more, Robert. I've waited long enough for my due." "Of course," Robert replied, his tone conciliatory. "I'll start making the necessary preparations. In the meantime, try to relax. Spend time with Malcolm. The nurses say that coma patients can often hear what's going on around them. It might help to talk to him, share some memories." Malcolm heard Evelyn's derisive snort. "Please, if he could hear me, don't you think he'd have woken up by now? No, Malcolm's gone, Robert. All that's left is to pick up the pieces and move on." As their footsteps faded and the door closed behind them, Malcolm lay in his bed, his mind whirling with this new information. He had a week, 1 week to figure out how to protect himself, his company, and everything he had worked for. But how? He was trapped in this bed, unable to move, unable to communicate. The very people he had trusted most in the world were plotting against him. For the first time since he had awakened in this nightmare, Malcolm felt a flicker of real fear. Then, slowly, an idea began to form. It was risky, potentially disastrous if it went wrong. But Malcolm Thornton hadn't built his empire by playing it safe. As the machines beeped steadily around him, monitoring the life he was pretending not to have, Malcolm began to plan. 1 week. It would have to be enough. As the days crawled by, Malcolm's world shrank to the confines of his hospital room. Every shift change, every whispered conversation, every beep of the machines became a focal point in his narrowed existence. He had always prided himself on his ability to analyze situations, to find solutions where others saw only problems. Now that skill was being put to the ultimate test. On the third day after Evelyn and Robert's conversation, a new voice entered Malcolm's auditory landscape. It was young, female, and carried a hint of an accent he couldn't quite place. "Good morning, Mr. Thornton," the voice said cheerfully. "I'm Zara, your new night nurse. I know you can't respond, but I believe it's important to introduce myself properly." Malcolm felt a gentle touch on his arm as Zara checked his vitals. Unlike the clinical efficiency of the other nurses, her movements were unhurried, almost tender. "You know, Mr. Thornton," Zara continued, her voice low and conspiratorial, "I've read all about you. It's quite impressive, what you've built. I come from a small village in India, and in my community we have a saying, a sleeping tiger is still a tiger. I think that applies to you, doesn't it?" Malcolm felt a spark of interest. This was different from the pitying tones or professional detachment he'd become accustomed to. Over the next few nights, Zara became a constant presence. She would chat to him as she worked, telling him about her day, her dreams of becoming a doctor, even the plot of the book she was reading. It was during one of these one-sided conversations that Malcolm's plan began to take shape. "I was watching a documentary about coma patients last night," Zara said as she adjusted his IV. "Did you know that some patients can communicate through eye movements? Even if they can't speak or move their bodies, they can sometimes blink or move their eyes in response to questions. Isn't that fascinating?" Malcolm's heart raced. This was it, the opportunity he'd been waiting for. But how could he signal to Zara without alerting anyone else? He needed to be certain she was trustworthy. As if reading his thoughts, Zara leaned in close. "Mr. Thornton," she whispered, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I don't trust your wife. The way she looks at you when she thinks no one's watching, it's not right. If you can hear me, if you're in there, I want to help." It was a risk, but Malcolm knew he had to take it. Summoning all his strength, he forced his eyelids to flutter. Zara gasped. "Mr. Thornton, can you hear me?" Malcolm blinked once, deliberately. "Oh my God," Zara breathed. "You're awake. You've been awake this whole time, haven't you?" Blink. "But why are you pretending? Wait, is it because of your wife? The conversations you've overheard?" Blink. Zara was silent for a moment, and Malcolm could almost hear the gears turning in her head. "Mr. Thornton, this is incredible, but also incredibly dangerous. We need to be careful. I want to help you, but we can't let anyone else know you're conscious. Not yet. Do you understand?" Blink. "Okay," Zara said, her voice steadying. "We need a system. 1 blink for yes, 2 for no. Is that okay?" Blink. "Good. Now, do you need immediate medical attention? Are you in pain?" 2 blinks. "All right. Is there someone you trust that we can contact? Someone outside the hospital?" Malcolm hesitated. Who could he trust? His circle had always been small, and now it seemed even smaller. Then a face flashed in his mind, young, earnest, trustworthy. Blink. "Okay, that's good. We'll figure out how to reach them. But first, Mr. Thornton, I need you to know that what we're doing is risky. If we're caught, I could lose my job, maybe even my nursing license. Are you sure you want to do this?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. Blink. He could hear the smile in Zara's voice as she responded. "All right then, let's do this. Now, here's what we're going to do." As Zara outlined her plan, Malcolm felt a surge of hope for the first time since he'd awakened in this nightmare. He wasn't alone anymore. He had an ally, a chance to fight back. The next few days would be crucial. Malcolm knew that Evelyn and Robert were planning to make their move soon. He had to act fast, had to find a way to outmaneuver them. But with Zara's help, he finally had a fighting chance. As the night wore on and Zara continued her duties, occasionally dropping hints about their secret communication to test if anyone was listening, Malcolm's mind raced with possibilities. He had built his empire from nothing once before. Now, trapped in his own body and betrayed by those closest to him, he would have to do it again. The game was on, and Malcolm Thornton was playing for everything he had. The following night, Zara returned to Malcolm's room with a determined glint in her eye. She went through her usual routine, checking his vitals and adjusting his medication, all while keeping up a stream of casual conversation for the benefit of anyone who might be listening. Once she was certain they were alone, Zara leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Thornton, I've made contact with the person you described. Your former assistant, Michael Chen?" He was shocked, but he believes me. He's ready to help. Malcolm felt a wave of relief wash over him. Michael had been more than just an assistant. He had been a protege, someone Malcolm had been grooming to take on greater responsibilities within the company. If there was anyone he could trust in this situation, it was Michael. "He's going to visit tomorrow," Zara continued. "I've arranged for my shift to coincide with his visit. We'll have to be extremely careful, but I think we can use this opportunity to start putting your plan into action." Malcolm blinked once, signaling his agreement. "Now," Zara said, her tone becoming more serious, "we need to discuss your medical condition. I've been reviewing your charts, and I have some concerns. Your prolonged immobility is putting you at risk for complications. We need to start some passive exercises to maintain your muscle tone and prevent blood clots." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "This might be painful, Mr. Thornton, and it will be hard to hide your reactions, but it's necessary for your health, and it might also provide us with an opportunity." Malcolm blinked once, curious about what she had in mind. Over the next hour, Zara explained her idea. They would use the physical therapy sessions as a cover for their communication and planning. The pain and discomfort Malcolm would inevitably experience would mask any involuntary reactions he might have during their secret conversations. It was risky, but it was also brilliant. As dawn approached, Zara finished her shift and left Malcolm alone with his thoughts. He ran through the plan in his mind, considering every angle, every potential pitfall. It wasn't foolproof, but it was the best chance he had. The next day passed in a blur of anticipation. Malcolm endured Evelyn's daily visit, gritting his teeth internally as she prattled on about trivial matters, her voice laced with false concern. He could sense her impatience growing with each passing day. Finally, as evening fell, he heard the door open and a familiar voice filled the room. "Mr. Thornton, it's Michael Chen. I hope you can hear me." Malcolm's heart raced. This was it. "Mrs. Thornton asked me to stop by," Michael continued, his voice slightly shaky. "She thought it might be good for you to hear a familiar voice from the office." There was a rustle as Michael sat down beside the bed. "I don't know if you can hear me, sir, but I want you to know that we're all pulling for you at the company. Things are, well, they're a bit chaotic without you, to be honest, but we're doing our best to keep everything running smoothly." The door opened again, and Malcolm heard Zara's voice. "Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just need to do Mr. Thornton's evening exercises." "Of course," Michael replied. "Should I leave?" "No, no," Zara said quickly. "Actually, it might be helpful if you could assist me. Sometimes having a familiar presence can help patients respond better to therapy." As Zara began the exercises, gently manipulating Malcolm's limbs, she kept up a steady stream of instructions to Michael. To anyone listening, it would sound like a routine physical therapy session, but Malcolm understood the hidden meaning behind her words. "Now, Mr. Chen, I need you to help me lift Mr. Thornton's arm. Gently, that's it. We're going to do this 10 times. 1, 2, 3. With each count, Zara applied slightly more pressure to Malcolm's arm. On the counts that corresponded to yes, Malcolm allowed himself to flinch slightly. On the no counts, he remained perfectly still. Through this painstaking method, over the course of an hour, Malcolm was able to communicate the broad strokes of his plan to Michael. He instructed him to gather evidence of Evelyn's infidelity, which he had long suspected, to quietly rally support among key board members, and to prepare for an emergency board meeting. As the session came to an end, Michael's voice was filled with a new energy. "Thank you for allowing me to help, nurse. Mr. Thornton, I think I understand now. Don't worry, sir. I'll take care of everything." After Michael left, Zara leaned in close to Malcolm. "You did great, Mr. Thornton. We're making progress. Just hold on a little longer." As Malcolm lay there in the darkness, his body aching from the exercises, but his mind sharp and focused, he felt a glimmer of hope. The pieces were falling into place. Now it was a race against time. Evelyn and Robert were planning to make their move in just 3 days. But little did they know Malcolm Thornton was about to stage the comeback of the century. The sleeping tiger was awakening, and he was ready to roar. The following night, Zara returned to Malcolm's room with a determined glint in her eye. She went through her usual routine, checking his vitals and adjusting his medication, all while keeping up a stream of casual conversation for the benefit of anyone who might be listening. Once she was certain they were alone, Zara leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Thornton, I've made contact with the person you described, your former assistant, Michael Chen. He was shocked, but he believes me. He's ready to help." Malcolm felt a wave of relief wash over him. Michael had been more than just an assistant. He had been a protege, someone Malcolm had been grooming to take on greater responsibilities within the company. If there was anyone he could trust in this situation, it was Michael. "He's going to visit tomorrow," Zara continued. "I've arranged for my shift to coincide with his visit. We will have to be extremely careful, but I think we can use this opportunity to start putting your plan into action." Malcolm blinked once, signaling his agreement. "Now," Zara said, her tone becoming more serious, "we need to discuss your medical condition. I've been reviewing your charts, and I have some concerns. Your prolonged immobility is putting you at risk for complications. We need to start some passive exercises to maintain your muscle tone and prevent blood clots." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "This might be painful, Mr. Thornton, and it will be hard to hide your reactions, but it's necessary for your health, and it might also provide us with an opportunity." Malcolm blinked once, curious about what she had in mind. Over the next hour, Zara explained her idea. They would use the physical therapy sessions as a cover for their communication and planning. The pain and discomfort Malcolm would inevitably experience would mask any involuntary reactions he might have during their secret conversations. It was risky, but it was also brilliant. As dawn approached, Zara finished her shift and left Malcolm alone with his thoughts. He ran through the plan in his mind, considering every angle, every potential pitfall. It wasn't foolproof, but it was the best chance he had. The next day passed in a blur of anticipation. Malcolm endured Evelyn's daily visit, gritting his teeth internally as she prattled on about trivial matters, her voice laced with false concern. He could sense her impatience growing with each passing day. Finally, as evening fell, he heard the door open and a familiar voice filled the room. "Mr. Thornton, it's Michael Chen. I hope you can hear me." Malcolm's heart raced. This was it. "Mrs. Thornton asked me to stop by," Michael continued, his voice slightly shaky. "She thought it might be good for you to hear a familiar voice from the office." There was a rustle as Michael sat down beside the bed. "I don't know if you can hear me, sir, but I want you to know that we're all pulling for you at the company. Things are, well, they're a bit chaotic without you, to be honest, but we're doing our best to keep everything running smoothly." The door opened again, and Malcolm heard Zara's voice. "Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just need to do Mr. Thornton's evening exercises." "Of course," Michael replied. "Should I leave?" "No, no," Zara said quickly. "Actually, it might be helpful if you could assist me. Sometimes having a familiar presence can help patients respond better to therapy." As Zara began the exercises, gently manipulating Malcolm's limbs, she kept up a steady stream of instructions to Michael. To anyone listening, it would sound like a routine physical therapy session. But Malcolm understood the hidden meaning behind her words. "Now, Mr. Chen, I need you to help me lift Mr. Thornton's arm. Gently, that's it. We're going to do this 10 times. 1, 2, 3. With each count, Zara applied slightly more pressure to Malcolm's arm. On the counts that corresponded to yes, Malcolm allowed himself to flinch slightly. On the no counts, he remained perfectly still. Through this painstaking method, over the course of an hour, Malcolm was able to communicate the broad strokes of his plan to Michael. He instructed him to gather evidence of Evelyn's infidelity, which he had long suspected, to quietly rally support among key board members, and to prepare for an emergency board meeting. As the session came to an end, Michael's voice was filled with a new energy. "Thank you for allowing me to help, nurse. Mr. Thornton, I think I understand now. Don't worry, sir. I'll take care of everything. After Michael left, Zara leaned in close to Malcolm. You did great, Mr. Thornton. We're making progress. Just hold on a little longer. As Malcolm lay there in the darkness, his body aching from the exercises, but his mind sharp and focused, he felt a glimmer of hope. The pieces were falling into place. Now it was a race against time. Evelyn and Robert were planning to make their move in just 3 days. But little did they know Malcolm Thornton was about to stage the comeback of the century. The sleeping tiger was awakening, and he was ready to roar. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of covert activity. Malcolm, still maintaining his comatose facade, became the silent orchestrator of a complex plan that was unfolding beyond the walls of his hospital room. Michael, true to his word, had sprung into action. Through Zara's nightly updates, Malcolm learned that his protege had been working tirelessly, gathering evidence and allies. The young man's loyalty and competence filled Malcolm with a sense of pride, tempering the bitter sting of Evelyn's betrayal. On the evening before Evelyn and Robert's planned move, Zara entered Malcolm's room with an air of nervous excitement. Mr. Thornton, she whispered as she checked his IV, everything is set for tomorrow. Michael has called an emergency board meeting for 10 a.m. He's managed to convince enough members that there's an urgent matter concerning the company's future. Malcolm blinked once, acknowledging the news. Your wife and Mr. Blackwell don't know about the meeting yet, Zara continued. They're planning to come here in the morning to start the process of having you declared legally incompetent, but we're going to beat them to the punch. She leaned in closer, her voice barely audible. Dr. Patel will be here at 9 a.m. for your final assessment before they arrive. That's when we make our move. As Zara outlined the last details of their plan, Malcolm felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. Everything hinged on perfect timing and execution. One misstep, and he could lose everything. The night passed slowly, each tick of the clock echoing in Malcolm's hyper-aware state. He rehearsed every possible scenario in his mind, steeling himself for what was to come. As dawn broke, Malcolm heard the door open. Dr. Patel's familiar voice filled the room. Good morning, Mr. Thornton. I'm here to do your final assessment before we meet with your wife. Malcolm remained still, his heart racing beneath his calm exterior. This was it. Dr. Patel began her examination, her touch clinical and efficient. Nurse Zara, could you assist me, please? Of course, doctor, Zara replied, her voice steady despite the tension Malcolm could sense. As Dr. Patel checked Malcolm's pupil response, Zara positioned herself by his side, out of the doctor's line of sight. Malcolm felt a gentle squeeze on his hand, the signal they had agreed upon. Taking a deep breath, Malcolm opened his eyes. Dr. Patel gasped, stumbling back in shock. Mr. Thornton, can you hear me? Malcolm's voice was hoarse from disuse, but clear. Yes, Dr. Patel, I can hear you. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Dr. Patel called for additional staff, her voice filled with a mix of confusion and excitement. Zara played her part perfectly, feigning surprise while efficiently assisting with Malcolm's sudden awakening. As the medical team swarmed around him, running tests and checking vitals, Malcolm locked eyes with Zara. She gave him a small, reassuring nod. Phase 1 was complete. Within the hour, Malcolm was sitting up in bed, sipping water, and answering Dr. Patel's barrage of questions. His responses were carefully crafted, clear enough to establish his mental competence, but vague enough to avoid revealing how long he had actually been conscious. Just as Dr. Patel was wrapping up her assessment, the door burst open. Evelyn rushed in, her face a mask of concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. Malcolm, oh, darling, you're awake. She moved to embrace him, but Malcolm held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. Evelyn, he said, his voice cool, how convenient of you to arrive just now, and with our lawyer in tow, I see. Robert Blackwell stood in the doorway, his face pale with shock. Evelyn's expression faltered for a moment before she recovered. Darling, what are you talking about? We've been so worried. We came as soon as we heard— Save it, Evelyn, Malcolm interrupted. I think it's time we had a frank discussion about the future. My future, the company's future, and your future. He turned to Dr. Patel. Doctor, would you mind giving us the room, and please send in Mr. Michael Chen. I believe he's waiting outside. As Dr. Patel and the medical staff filed out, replaced by a determined-looking Michael, Malcolm felt a surge of strength. The pieces were in place, the stage was set. It was time for Malcolm Thornton to take back control of his life, his company, and his destiny. As he looked at the shocked faces of Evelyn and Robert, contrasted with the loyal determination in Michael's eyes, Malcolm allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. The game wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The tension in the hospital room was palpable as Malcolm faced his would-be betrayers. Evelyn's face had lost its mask of concern, replaced by a mix of shock and calculation. Robert Blackwell stood frozen, his legal briefcase hanging limply at his side. Michael Chen positioned himself near Malcolm's bed, a quiet but resolute presence. Malcolm took a moment to savor the scene before speaking. "I think it's time we lay our cards on the table, don't you?" Evelyn was the first to recover. "Malcolm, darling, I don't know what you think you've heard, but—" "Stop," Malcolm interrupted, his voice sharp. "I've heard enough over the past week to last a lifetime. Did you really think I wouldn't fight back?" Robert stepped forward, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. "Now, Malcolm, you've been through a traumatic experience. You're confused." "I'm not confused, Robert," Malcolm cut him off. "In fact, I've never been clearer about anything in my life." He turned to Michael. "Would you mind sharing what you've discovered with our guests?" Michael nodded, pulling out a tablet. "Mrs. Thornton, over the past 48 hours, we've compiled extensive evidence of your extramarital affairs, your attempts to manipulate company finances, and your conspiracy with Mr. Blackwell to have Mr. Thornton declared incompetent." Evelyn's face drained of color. "You can't prove any of that." "Actually," Michael continued, his voice steady, "we can. We have emails, phone records, and testimonies from several key witnesses, including, I might add, your personal assistant, who was more than happy to cooperate once we explained the situation." Robert's legal mind was clearly racing. "This is all circumstantial. You have no right—" "We have every right," Malcolm interjected. "As of this morning, the board has voted to temporarily suspend both of you pending a full investigation. Michael, would you mind stepping out and asking security to come in? I believe Mrs. Thornton and Mr. Blackwell will be leaving now." As Michael moved to the door, Evelyn's composure finally cracked. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked. "I've given you the best years of my life. I deserve—" "You deserve to be held accountable for your actions," Malcolm said, his voice cold, "just as I'm holding myself accountable for my blindness all these years." Security entered the room, and with a nod from Malcolm, they escorted a protesting Evelyn and a silently fuming Robert out. As the door closed behind them, Malcolm let out a long breath. He turned to Michael, his expression softening. "Thank you, Michael. I couldn't have done this without you." Michael smiled, relief evident on his face. "It's good to have you back, sir. The company needs you." "And I need the company," Malcolm replied. "But first, there's someone else I need to thank." He pressed the call button, and moments later, Zara entered the room. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her professional demeanor belied by the twinkle in her eye. "How are you feeling?" Malcolm reached out and took her hand. "Zara, I owe you more than I can ever repay. Your kindness, your intelligence, your bravery. You saved more than just my life. You saved everything I've worked for." Zara blushed, squeezing his hand. "I just did what was right, Mr. Thornton, but what happens now?" Malcolm leaned back, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Now, we rebuild. Michael, I want you to work with our PR team. We need to control the narrative about my miraculous recovery and the changes in company leadership." Michael nodded, already tapping notes into his tablet. "Zara," Malcolm continued, "I know you have dreams of becoming a doctor. How would you feel about full scholarship to the medical school of your choice, courtesy of the Thornton Foundation?" Zara's eyes widened. "Mr. Thornton, I couldn't possibly—" "You can, and you will," Malcolm insisted. "Consider it an investment in the future of healthcare. And please, call me Malcolm." As the three of them began to discuss the details of the days to come, Malcolm felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced in years. This ordeal had stripped away the complacency that had settled over his life, revealing not just the rot at its core, but also the potential for new growth. He had lost a wife, but gained true friends. He had nearly lost his company, but rediscovered his passion for it. And most importantly, he had almost lost himself, but instead found a newer, stronger version of Malcolm Thornton. As he looked out the hospital window at the city skyline, Malcolm smiled. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with legal battles, public scrutiny, and the hard work of rebuilding trust. But for the first time in a long time, he was genuinely excited about the future. The sleeping tiger had awakened, and the world had better be ready. Malcolm Thornton was back, and this time he was determined to get it right. In the weeks that followed Malcolm's dramatic awakening, the Thornton empire underwent a seismic shift. The media buzzed with speculation about the miraculous recovery of the business tycoon and the subsequent shakeup in his company and personal life. Malcolm, however, was focused on the monumental task of rebuilding and reshaping his world. The first order of business was addressing the company's board of directors. In a closed-door meeting that lasted well into the night, Malcolm laid out his vision for the future of Thornton Industries. He spoke with a passion and clarity that many of the longtime board members hadn't seen in years. "Gentlemen, ladies," Malcolm began, his voice strong despite his recent ordeal, "we stand at a crossroads. The events of the past few weeks have shown us how fragile our foundation can be when corruption takes root, but they've also shown us the strength we possess when we stand together for what's right." He outlined a comprehensive plan for corporate restructuring, emphasizing transparency, ethical practices, and innovation. By the end of the meeting, even the most skeptical board members were won over by Malcolm's renewed vigor and clear-eyed strategy. On the personal front, Malcolm wasted no time in filing for divorce from Evelyn. The evidence Michael had gathered proved instrumental in ensuring a swift and decisive legal victory. Evelyn's attempts to claim a substantial portion of Malcolm's wealth crumbled in the face of the damning proof of her infidelity and conspiracy. Robert Blackwell, once a trusted advisor, found his legal career in tatters. The Bar Association launched an investigation into his ethical violations, and former clients began to distance themselves from the disgraced lawyer. But even as Malcolm dismantled the negative aspects of his old life, he focused on building something new and better. He threw himself into philanthropic efforts, establishing a foundation aimed at supporting medical research and providing scholarships to promising students from underprivileged backgrounds. Zara, true to her word, accepted the scholarship to medical school. Before she left, Malcolm insisted on hosting a small gathering to thank her properly. "Zara," he said, raising a glass in her honor, "you showed me what true integrity looks like. Your actions reminded me of the person I once was, the person I want to be again. I can never thank you enough." Zara, blushing but standing tall, replied, "Mr. Thornton, Malcolm, you gave me the chance to do the right thing. I'll carry that lesson with me always." As for Michael, Malcolm made good on his long-held plans to groom the young man for greater responsibilities. He was promoted to Chief Operating Officer, a move that raised some eyebrows in the business world but quickly proved to be a masterstroke. Michael's innovative ideas and unwavering loyalty helped steer Thornton Industries into a new era of success. 6 months after his awakening, Malcolm stood at the podium of a prestigious business forum, ready to deliver a keynote speech. As he looked out at the sea of faces, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for far too long. "Life has a way of waking us up," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed auditorium. "Sometimes it's a gentle nudge, and sometimes it's a seismic shock that shatters everything we thought we knew. My wake-up call came in the form of a hospital bed and the realization that I had lost sight of what truly matters." He paused, letting his words sink in. But that moment of crisis became an opportunity for rebirth. It taught me that true strength lies not in the empires we build or the wealth we amass, but in the integrity with which we live our lives and the positive impact we have on others. As Malcolm continued his speech, outlining his vision for a new kind of corporate responsibility, he felt a sense of alignment that had been missing for years. The man he was now, older, wiser, but also more passionate and purposeful, was finally the man he had always aspired to be. The applause that followed his speech was thunderous, but Malcolm found his attention drawn to a small group at the back of the room. Michael stood there, beaming with pride. Next to him was Zara, who had flown in specially for this event, taking a break from her rigorous medical studies. As Malcolm stepped down from the podium, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The path that had led him here had been fraught with betrayal and hardship, but it had also revealed the true friends and allies who would stand by him through anything. Malcolm Thornton, the man who had once pretended to be dead to save his life's work, had found something far more valuable in the process. he had found himself. And this time, he was determined to live life wide awake, with purpose, integrity, and a renewed commitment to making a difference in the world. As he joined Michael and Zara, ready to celebrate this new chapter, Malcolm knew that the best was yet to come. The sleeping tiger had not just awakened, it had been transformed.